What's up, guys? Mr. Slyway here. We're going to start our Civil War topic stuff with the debate over slavery, kind of talking a little bit about how we get to where we get when the Civil War is about to start, okay? So, in 1849, you've got Congress just filled with a bunch of guys that do not trust each other. You've got the South constantly threatening secession, different states in the South, different places in the South, leaving the United States if they don't get what they want. It becomes a commonplace thing, okay? So you've got this guy named Henry Clay who decides, once again, here we go, he's going to try to come up with some sort of a compromise between the North and the South, okay? So he comes up with a compromise of 1850, where California is going to be admitted as a free state. Utah and New Mexico are going to have popular sovereignty. They're going to vote based on their population whether or not to be free or slave. It's going to have the fugitive slave laws, where if you find a slave, a runaway slave in the North, your responsibility is to return that slave to the South, or you can be punished. More on that later. And the D.C. slave trade policy, which will end the slave trade in D.C., but it won't end owning slaves in D.C. So just the ability to buy and sell them. Okay, the Senate is going to reject Henry Clay's compromise, his proposal. He tries to pass the whole thing in one big bundle. The Senate's going to reject it on the grounds that it's too much. People just don't agree with what's going on. So, in comes Stephen A. Douglas, senator, who's going to take that plan, break it into 4 different parts, and try to pass it individually. California being admitted as a state, Utah and New Mexico, the fugitive slave laws, and the D.C. slave trade policy. When he does that, it finally passes in the Senate. So Stephen A. Douglas is kind of heralded as this hero during all this mess, when in reality, all he does is break apart Henry Clay's proposal. All right? So let's take a deeper look at that Fugitive Slave Act that says that if you find a runaway slave in the North, it's your responsibility to return them to the South. Not only that, if you returned a alleged slave to the South, you could get $10, right? If you return them to their owner, you could get $10. You only got $5 if you freed that person. So there wasn't much of an incentive to free someone. There was a much bigger incentive to send them back to the South, or assume that they were a slave in the first place. And to make things worse, if you were caught helping a runaway slave, there was a $1,000 fine and possible imprisonment. So there wasn't much of an incentive to actually help somebody versus bringing them back or claiming they were a slave in the first place. A lot of Northerners didn't like this, and they organized into committees to help African Americans get to Canada, to get out of the United States in general. In fact, 9 states would pass personal liberty laws to try and kind of limit this policy. They would forbid imprisonment of runaway slaves. They would forbid sending them back to the South, and they gave them the right to a trial by jury. When that happens, the Underground Railroad is established. You get conductors or runners like Harriet Tubman, who would take 19 trips and free over 300 slaves herself. And they would stop at different stations or places on the way from the South to the North with the ultimate goal of getting people to Canada for the most part. Another abolitionist during this time would be Harriet Beecher Stowe. She would write Uncle Tom's Cabin. It would become a bestseller because it was about kind of slave life in the South, but it gave wealthy white Northerners a look into how those things were going. So it made them start to think that slavery wasn't just a political issue, but it was also a moral struggle as well. All right? We're going to pick up there in a second with part 2 with the Nebraska and Kansas Acts.